The Constitution of the United Kingdom has evolved over a long period of time, beginning in the predecessor states to the United Kingdom and continuing to the present day. The relative stability of the British polity over centuries, progressing without a revolutionary regime change that lasted, has obviated the need to write a constitution from first principles, in contrast to many other countries. What Britain has instead is an accumulation of various statutes, judicial precedents, convention, treaties and other sources which collectively can be referred to as the British Constitution. It is thus more accurate to describe Britain's constitution as an uncodified constitution, rather than an unwritten one. Key statutes. There are certain statutes that are significant in the history of the Constitution of the United Kingdom. Some have been repealed, several have been amended and remain in statute, while others are current legislation as originally enacted. None are entrenched. Selected English and Welsh statutes: Magna Carta, Provisions of Oxford, Provisions of Westminster, Statute of Marlborough, Statute of Rhuddlan. Laws in Wales Acts chapters 1535 to 1542. Wales became a full and equal part of the Kingdom of England. Petition of Right, Instrument of Government, First Constitution of England, replaced in 1657. Humble Petition and Advice, Second Constitution of England. Habeas Corpus Act 1679. Bill of Rights 1689. Act of Settlement 1701, agreed to by Parliament of Scotland as part of the Treaty of Union with Scotland Act 1706. Selected Scottish Statutes: Claim of Right Act 1689, Union with England Act 1707. Selected British Statutes: Acts of Union 1800, Union of Great Britain and Ireland to form the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Reform Act 1832, Reform Act 1867, Reform Act 1884, Representation of the People Act 1918, Representation of the People Act 1928, Representation of the People Act 1949, Representation of the People Act 1969, extending the vote to all adults equally. Parliament Acts Chapter 1911 and 1949. Government of Ireland Act 1920, Irish Free State Act 1922, Irish Free State Constitution Act 1922, and Irish Free State Act 1922. Royal and Parliamentary Titles Act 1927. Statute of Westminster 1931. His Majesty's Declaration of Abdication Act 1936, Life Peerages Act 1958, House of Lords Act 1999, European Communities Act 1972, European Union Act 2011, Northern Ireland Constitution Act 1973, Human Rights Act 1998. Scotland Act 1998, Government of Wales Act 1998, Government of Wales Act 2006, Northern Ireland Act 1998, Freedom of Information Act 2000, Political Parties, Elections and Referendums Act 2000, Civil Contingencies Act 2004, Constitutional Reform Act 2005. Constitutional Reform and Governance Act 2010, Fixed-Term Parliaments Act 2011, Succession to the Crown Act 2013. Pre-Civil War England. Before the Norman Conquest, the Kingdom of England was formed in the mid-9th century. For example, Alfred the Great issued laws as King of the West Saxons, and what is now recognized as England came about in 927 AD when the last of the Heptarchy kingdoms fell under the rule of the King of the English, Athelstan. On the 14th of October 1066, King Harold II of England was killed while leading his men in the Battle of Hastings against Duke William of Normandy. The event completely changed the course of English history. Until 1066, England was ruled by monarchs that were elected by the witan. There were various elements of democracy at a local level too, known as folkmoot. The Normans. Henry I of England was king from 1100 to 1135, ruling through the Curia Regis. When he ascended to the throne, he granted the Charter of Liberties, a series of decrees and assurances to the barons. Probably the most important statement in the Charter is at the beginning, where the king admits that by the mercy of God and the common council of the barons of the whole kingdom of England I have been crowned king of said kingdom. This represented a step away from absolute rule. The king had recognized that the right to rule came not only from God but also from the common council of the barons. The Plantagenets. King John was king of England from 1199 to 1216. He was the youngest brother of Richard I. His reign was fraught with conflicts. There was conflict between England and France, between England and the Pope, and between the king and the barons. Eventually the barons forced John to sign the Magna Carta, a practical solution to the political crisis he faced in 1215, which established for the first time the principle that everybody, including the king, was subject to the law. Henry III succeeded his father John. Henry was only 9 years of age when he became king, and so the country was ruled by regents until Henry reached the age of 20. Under pressure from the barons, led by Simon de Montfort, 6th Earl of Leicester, Henry had to accept constitutional limitations on the monarchy placed by provisions of Oxford and provisions of Westminster and the existence of the first representative English Parliament. The Ordinances of 1311 were a series of regulations imposed on King Edward II by the lords and higher clergy to restrict the power of the king. Later in the 14th century, during the reign of Richard II, there was an uprising known as the Peasants' Revolt. The rebels came very close to the demands being granted by the king, but at the end the protesters were tricked out of such gains. The revolt remains as an important moment in history, but it failed to contribute to the written body of the Constitution. The Tudors. The first act of supremacy made King Henry VIII the supreme head of the Church of England. Henry VIII died in 1547, leaving 3 children as potential heirs. The second act of supremacy restored these powers over the Church to Elizabeth I, reversing normalizing legislation passed during the reign of her sister Mary I. Although the title Elizabeth gained was Supreme Governor of the Church of England rather than Supreme Head, so as not to imply that she had control over the Church's doctrine, or that the monarch was usurping the primacy of Jesus. The act also required all office holders, including the clergy, to take an oath of allegiance acknowledging the Queen as the Supreme Governor of the Church of England. The monarchy had to get the consent of Parliament in all issues, but with the threat of war looming from Spain, Parliament showed great loyalty toward Queen Elizabeth, who was a strong leader. However, after the Spanish Armada was defeated in 1588, Parliament felt safer and thus it decreased its loyalty to the monarchy. Parliament consisted of 2 levels of administration: the House of Lords, that was made up of the influential peers of the realm and lords spiritual, and the House of Commons, which consisted of representative members of the aristocracy and the middle class. The House of Commons had grown sharply, doubling in size due to the prosperity of the middle class during that time. There were a number of vocal Puritans in the House of Commons who began asking for more rights for the Puritans, but Elizabeth I was strong enough to ignore the demands. James I would later have problems with them. John Aylmer, a Greek scholar, saw an immediate resemblance of the Tudor constitution to that of the classical Republic of Sparta. Geoffrey Elton, who read the Tudor constitution, gave hearty approval to Aylmer's conclusions. It was the Greek scholars, such as Aylmer, that popularized the Greek classical political terminology and influenced English and later British constitutionalist thought. They brought forward the idea of mixed government from classical antiquity and applied it to the form of government. James VI and I. When Queen Elizabeth I died in 1603 without issue, she was succeeded by her cousin James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and he became King James I of England. This was a major step towards creating a single British state, although the Kingdom of Great Britain did not come about until 100 years later. James VI faced a fractious religious England since it contained Anglicans, Puritans, Separatists, and also many Roman Catholics, although many did not declare the continuing allegiance to Rome, which was the cause of much mistrust. James VI was a believer in the divine right of kings, which stated that kings were chosen by God and should therefore be absolute and answerable only to God. This was corroborated by his Presbyterian belief in predestination, and such a birthright as kingship made him almost explicitly a part of the elect. Though he was Presbyterian, he was against the Presbyterian idea of allowing the congregation to elect the presbyters since it undermined his absolutism. Thus he was often at odds with the Puritans, who were English Presbyterians. He did concede to the Puritans by commissioning the King James Bible, an English-language translation and interpretation of the Bible. Then James VI began fighting with the Roman Catholics, but eventually gave them rights, exempting them from having to pay tithes to the Anglican Church, but this caused a great decrease in Anglican Church revenue, so he quickly took those rights away. The actions of King James VI were unpopular during his reign. The Civil War. Charles I and the Civil War. James was succeeded by his son who became Charles I in 1625. Charles I believed in the divine right of kings, like his father, and thus continued to fight with Parliament. Parliament's main power at this time was its control of the taxes. Parliament demanded more power over the taxes. Traditionally, Parliament had voted at the beginning of a king's reign on the amount allowed for a king's tonnage and poundage, the customs duties that made up a large portion of a king's annual income. Now Parliament wanted to re-evaluate these taxes annually, which would give it more control over the king. James I resisted this abrogation of his divine right and dealt with the situation by dissolving Parliament. Charles I did the same at first and later just ignored its annual evaluations. Charles acquired much of his money with forced loans from the rich. He also received a lot of money through taxes. One important tax that Charles collected was the ship money tax that required the counties bordering the sea to fund a navy to protect the English coastline. The coastal counties were unhappy with it since Charles was collecting the ship money tax during a time of peace and since he wasn't using it really to fund the navy. To get even more money, Charles placed the ship money tax on the interior counties as well, which angered the English people, because now Charles was creating new taxes without the consent of the Parliament, which was against the law. A man in London named John Hampden, who was also a member of Parliament, refused to pay this new interior ship money tax, so he was tried for a crime by Charles I and lost with a vote of 7-5. This meant that 5 of 12 jurors were against their king, which did not look good or bode well for Charles I. But Charles I was at war with France and Spain, and this drained a lot of money from him. so he was forced to call upon Parliament to make new taxes for him. Parliament would not grant Charles new taxes until he had signed the Petition of Rights that established conditions in which Charles had to submit to the law of the Parliament. The king could not establish martial law in England during times of peace. The king could not levy taxes without the consent of the Parliament. The king could not arbitrarily imprison people. The king could not quarter soldiers in private homes. After Charles got the taxes from Parliament, he dissolved Parliament and broke the tenets of the Petition of Rights which, under the divine right theory, he considered void. William Laud and Thomas Wentworth were appointed to fill the void that the Duke of Buckingham left, on top of the wars England had with France and with Spain. Charles I and William Laud began a war with Scotland in an attempt to convert Scotland to the Church of England. This was called the Bishops' War, and it had two major parts. The First Bishops' War ended in a truce. The Second Bishops' War, the following year, began with the Scottish invasion of England, in which the Scottish defeated the English and remained stationed in England until their issues were solved. To get the Scottish out, Charles I signed the Treaty of Ripon, which required England to pay an indemnity of £850 for each day that the Scottish were stationed in England. During the second part of the Bishops' War, Charles I had run very low on money, so he was forced to call a parliament to make new taxes. He and the parliament could not agree on anything, so after 3 weeks, Charles I dissolved the parliament. Then he desperately needed new taxes, so Charles I called the parliament again, and it would only help him if he agreed to some terms, which ultimately made Charles I a constitutional monarch. It was called the Long Parliament because it was not officially dissolved by its own vote until 1660. These terms were that Charles I had to impeach Thomas Wentworth and William Laud. He reluctantly placed them under arrest and put them in the Tower, executing Wentworth in 1641 and William Laud in 1645. Charles I had to agree to the Triennial Act, which required the Parliament to meet every 3 years with or without the King's consent. Charles I had to abolish the Court of the Star Chamber, a royal court controlled completely by Charles I, in which the prosecutor was also the judge, and it was intended to be used to implement the will of the king legally with a judicial facade. It was considered an extra-legal court. It dealt with odd cases and punishments. Charles I had to abolish the High Court, which was the same as the Court of the Star Chamber, though it dealt with religious heresy. It was considered an extra-legal court. Charles I had to accept the Grand Remonstrance and allow the circulation of its copies, and it was a document that outlined the crimes that officials had accused Charles of committing since the beginning of his reign. Charles I was also never to do any of those crimes again. Charles I, most importantly, had to agree never to dissolve a parliament without the consent of the parliament. Most of England believed that Parliament had done enough to curb the power of King Charles I, but the radicals in Parliament and the radicals around the country wanted to reform the Church of England by getting rid of the bishops and by establishing the Puritans' method of worship as the standard. This caused a political division in Parliament, so Charles I took advantage of it. He then sent 500 soldiers into the House of Commons to arrest 5 of the Puritans' ringleaders. The 5 ringleaders had been tipped off, so they had left Parliament, and Charles I was left with only shame for storming Parliament. King Charles I left London and went to Oxford, and the English Civil War began. The north and west of England were on Charles I's side. They were known as the Cavaliers. Charles I created an army illegally. The south and east of England were on Parliament's side and were known as Roundheads, for the haircuts. In response to Charles I raising an army, they did so as well, yet they didn't have the military might that King Charles I had. So they solicited the help of the Scottish with the Solemn League and Covenant that promised to impose the Presbyterian religion on the Church of England. They called their army the New Model Army, and they made its commander Oliver Cromwell, who was also a member of Parliament. The New Model Army was composed mostly of Presbyterians. Oliver Cromwell and the Commonwealth. Though Parliament won, it was clear to the Scots that it was not going to uphold the Solemn League and Covenant by imposing Presbyterianism on England. So the New Model Army, Parliament and the Scots began falling apart. The Scots were paid for the help and sent back to Scotland. The Presbyterian Roundheads were interested in freedom to practice the religion and not in making the Presbyterian religion the state religion. Cromwell proposed that Parliament reinstate the bishops of the Church of England and King Charles I as a constitutional monarch, but allow for the toleration of other religions. Though at the end of the war, the people of England could accept Charles I back in office but not religious toleration. They also wanted the New Model Army dissolved since it was a provocative factor. Thus Parliament disallowed religious toleration and voted to disband the New Model Army, but the New Model Army refused the order. Charles I then made the same deal that the Roundheads had made with the Scottish and parliamentary Presbyterians. He solicited the help of Scotland and in return he promised to impose Presbyterianism on England. The New Model Army would not allow this deal to be made. Thus a new civil war broke out in 1648. This time, Scotland, the parliamentary Presbyterians and the Royalists were on the side of Charles I. The New Model Army and the rest of Parliament were against him. In the Battle of Preston, Cromwell and his New Model Army defeated Charles I. Then one of Cromwell's officers, Colonel Pride, destroyed the Presbyterian majority in Parliament by driving out of Parliament 143 Presbyterians of the 203. The new Parliament constituted a rump Parliament, which was a Parliament in which the minority carried on in the name of the majority that was kicked out. The Rump Parliament abolished the monarchy and the House of Lords in Parliament, created a republic called the Commonwealth that was really just a dictatorship run by Cromwell. Scotland was against Cromwell's Commonwealth and declared Charles I's son king at Edinburgh as King Charles II. But Cromwell and the New Model Army defeated him and he fled to France where he stayed until 1660. Cromwell then went to Ireland to govern it but was disgusted with the Catholics, so he massacred many of them and so the Irish rebelled against him as well. Cromwell then dissolved the Rump Parliament and declared himself to be the Lord Protector. Richard Cromwell and Charles II. Cromwell died and was succeeded by his son Richard Cromwell, who tried to keep power militarily and absolutely, but he was also incapable of unifying all of the diverse groups. General George Monk came down from Scotland and overthrew Richard. He then invited the remnants of the Long Parliament to reconvene. The Long Parliament met and officially ended when it voted to dissolve itself and created new Parliament. The new Parliament began the Restoration by choosing Charles I's son Charles II to be the King of England. Post-Civil War, popular political movements. The idea of a political party with factions took form around the time of the Civil War. Soldiers from the parliamentarian New Model Army and a faction of Levellers freely debated rights to political representation during the Putney debates of 1647. The Levellers published a newspaper and pioneered political petitions, pamphleteering and party colours. Later, the pre-war Royalist and opposing parliamentarian groupings became the Tory party and the Whigs in the Parliament. In 1649, Diggers, a small people's political reform movement, published the True Levelers Standard Advanced, or the State of Community Opened, and presented to the Sons of Men. This is another important document in the history of British constitutionalism, though different from the others listed here, because the Diggers' Declaration comes from the people instead of from the state. They are sometimes called True Levelers to distinguish themselves from the larger political group called the Levelers, which had supported the Republicans during the Civil War. The Diggers were not satisfied with what had been gained by the war against the king and wanted instead a dismantling of the state. They can be best understood through such philosophies as libertarianism, anarchism, and religious communism. Also at this time, the Polish Brethren arrived in England and Holland. The sect of Polish Brethren had been driven out of Poland after the deluge because they were commonly considered to be collaborators with the Swedish. The Diggers' radical ideas influenced thinkers in Poland, Holland, and England, playing an especially important role in the philosophy of John Locke. Locke, in turn, profoundly impacted the development of political ideas regarding liberty, which would later influence the founding fathers of the United States. Glorious Revolution. The Glorious Revolution was the overthrow of James II in 1688 and his replacement with William and Mary as joint monarchs. The Convention Parliament of 1689 drew up a Declaration of Right to address perceived abuses of government under James II and to secure the religion and liberties of Protestants. This was enacted by the Parliament of England as the Bill of Rights 1689, which limited royal power and reaffirmed certain civil rights. Building on the Petition of Rights 1628 and the Habeas Corpus Act 1679, the Parliament of Scotland approved it as the Claim of Right. Both the Bill of Rights and the Claim of Right contributed a great deal to the establishment of the concept of parliamentary sovereignty and the curtailment of the powers of the monarch, leading ultimately to the establishment of constitutional monarchy. They furthered the protection of the rule of law, which had started to become a principle of the way the country is governed. Act of Settlement. In the Act of Settlement 1701, Parliament altered the line of succession to the throne. In order to preserve the Protestant succession, Parliament ensured the crown would pass to Sophia, the granddaughter of James I and first cousin to Charles II and James II. Sophia's son George I became king in 1714 and his descendants, including the incumbent monarch Queen Elizabeth II, have reigned Britain ever since. The Act also introduced the concept of judicial independence by establishing that judges can keep the position as long as they maintain good behavior. Before 1701, a judge's position was held at the discretion of the monarch, and there were instances of judges being removed from the position after making judgments that the monarch did not like. After the Act of Settlement, a judge could only be removed from office by the agreement of both the House of Commons and the House of Lords with the subsequent approval of the monarch. The Kingdom of Great Britain. On the 1st of May 1707, the Kingdom of Great Britain was created by the political union of the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of Scotland. This event was the result of the Treaty of Union that was agreed on the 22nd of July 1706, and then ratified by both the Parliament of England and Parliament of Scotland, each passing an Act of Union in 1707. This led to the formation of the first Parliament of Great Britain. The role of Prime Minister began to emerge during the period 1721 to 1742 as Robert Walpole chaired cabinet meetings, appointed all other ministers, and developed the doctrine of cabinet solidarity.